this white guy is telling you Bob's story. There are a lot of things that aren't here, and I'm here to fill in the blanks. This is sponsored by Universal and Cedella Marley from the Marley family. Universal handles all of Bob's copyrights. So it begins in 1973 with the release of Bob's first international album, Catch a Fire, and I will fill in all the blanks from his birth forward. So we're kind of beginning in the middle here, and that room is Bob's birthplace, and we'll talk about his early life in there. There'll be 5 stops. We'll give you time in between my talks to look around, and at the end you can come back and go through everything you want to see more of. And it ends when we exit through the gift shop. As someone once said. How many of you seen that movie? The other guy with Banksy in the movie is Mr. Brainwash. And he did that collage down there. There's a whole lot of his work all through the exhibition. It's really clever stuff. And down at the end of the room is handwritten lyrics by Bob that are on loan from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So let us begin now. You can come a little closer because I want to talk about each of these albums. This album was released initially under the name The Wailers. Chris Blackwell wanted to promote them as a rock band like Who or Traffic, and Bob's name didn't appear on it. And it looked like a Zippo lighter. You opened it up in the middle, and when it was re-released, they used this cover. 1973, Chris Blackwell brought them to England to record this album, and when they weren't in the studio, they were doing live shows. And Chris says, I will cover all your expenses on the tour. And at the end of the tour, he gave them a bill for $41,000. And Bunny flipped out. He didn't understand how the music business worked. You know, the label gives you tour support, but they deduct it from the royalties of your recordings. And he got very upset. And then Chris says, well, I'm going to have to, build you up for 4 or 5 years because right now you're nobody. And Bunny says, well, a body is a dead people, and I'm not dead. And where are you going to put us? And Chris says, well, I'm going to start you out in freak clubs. And he says, what does that mean? And Chris says, well, that's where guys go to meet guys and girls go to meet girls. And, well, I'm not doing with that degeneracy stuff. And he quit the group on the spot after 10 years. And the cliche of the roller coaster career is so apt for the Wailers, because right from the start they were working with top producers who gave them great promises and dashed their hopes over and over for 10 years until they meet Blackwell. So they finished recording this album, and in the fall they are the opening act across America for Sly and the Family Stone. And there were never 2 more mismatched bands on tour ever than that. And all of these guys and girls, his legend, of course, coats and bling. 39 years after its release, last week it was #1 on the reggae charts in Billboard, if you can imagine that. And it has been longer on the Billboard catalog charts than any album in the history of popular music, including Dark Side of the Moon, which came out 10 years earlier. Yeah, and it's always toward the top of that catalog list. Young people tell me when they go to college, if in freshman year your dorm mates say they've never heard of Bob Marley, by the end of the first week everybody will have brought their Marley records down and you become an instant fan. So Bob predicted the music would just get bigger and bigger till it met all its rightful people, but I think he was talking about himself as well. So that brings us to the end of the first part of the 5-part tour. It flopped. As I say, and it turned out it was a country and western cover also. Bob didn't write a word of it. So he goes back to Trenchtown, and he and Bunny Wailer start rehearsing and singing with a new fellow who's just arrived in town from Savannah, Lamar, called Winston Hubert McIntosh, who we know as Peter Tosh, and he had a guitar. And he was the only person they ever met who actually owned a guitar. So they brought him into the group immediately. And there was a woman who rehearsed for 2 years with him who rarely gets mentioned by anyone. And her name was Cherry Green. Her real name was Ermine Bramwell. And she rehearsed for 20 years, and when it came time to audition for Cox and Dodd in June of '64, she couldn't get off work. So the night before, they had heard a woman in Trenchtown singing named Beverly Kelso, and they went to her mother and they said, "We're going to record tomorrow. Can we use your daughter? Can she be in the Wailers?" So depending on who you talk to,
his own record label.
she was a
And
Wailer
one of
for
his
24
closest
hours.
friends there at Coxon Studio One was this wonderful man called Bob Andy. Now, Bob Andy had a huge hit in England in 1970 with Marcia Griffiths, cover of Nina Simone's Young, Gifted, and Black. It was top 5. And he was a writer at Coxon Studio as well as a performer. And this was a beautiful passage, so I wanted to share this with all of you. Bob Andy said, "There was a room at Studio One where we used to listen to records. Coxon would give artists music to listen to on this turntable and speakers, but there was another room between Coxon's inner office and the music room where you could go and lock yourself in and no one else could enter. The Wailers had access to that, and so did I. One particular day, I was witness to a very special performance. It was like being let into a secret. I was very high from smoking, and they were always high too. It was the first time I had seen each of the Wailers with a guitar. And each time I remember this, it's like remembering a dream. I sat there and they were just messing around with various songs for a while, but finally it climaxed with a song called 10 to 1, which I learned was a Curtis Mayfield song. Bob sang the first line, then Bunny came in on the second, and all three came in on the next line. Peter sang a line, and then all three sang in harmony. Then Bob and Bunny sang solo again. When they started that song, I saw a side of the Wailers I felt no one else had ever seen. It was like my own personal revelation. I've never heard music so beautiful, and I've never seen such love and camaraderie in all my life. I knew then that the Wailers were special people, but they were special by being the Wailers as a unit. When I reflect on that occasion, it was divine. It was like being on a spaceship listening to the music of the spheres. I was spellbound, and that memory will stay with me forever. Don't you wish you could have been in that room?
Yes.
So that was the Wailers as they embark on their own finally. They get just enough money to cut their first record, and as a gesture of goodwill, they record it at Coxon's studio, and Coxon immediately bootlegs it. It was called Freedom Time, a cry of liberation from the oppressive system of the greedy producers. And the Wailers had two goals in mind for their whole career. One was to reach the African American audience, and the other was to earn enough money that they could build their own house where they could live communally with all their families and have a studio in it, so whenever the inspiration struck, they could go right into the studio day or night and make their music. And that unfortunately never happened. And they had to now pay for the pressing of their own records. So they never really got enough money in front of them. They went around, Rita and Bob, on bicycles with racks full of records that they would sell on the street or take to record stores. It was a really, really primitive operation. And in 1968, they meet, how shall I put this delicately, they meet a mafia-adjacent producer, label owner named Danny Sims. Danny Sims' partner in the Jad record label, Johnny, Arthur, and Danny, was Johnny Nash. Remember, I can see clearly now? And Arthur Jenkins, the producer. But their backer, their money man, was Joe Armoni, one of the chief hitmen for the Gambino family. So Bob was basically owned for the next 4 years by the mafia. And they made a lot of records and tried to get airplay on the American black stations, and no one would touch them. I mean, they sounded like doo-wop, and this is late 60s when psychedelic rock was coming in, and they were singing in patois that people couldn't understand, and the rhythm was too slow, and they never got airplay, and it was a great frustration for them. And after a couple of years with Danny, they returned to Leslie Kong, who had recorded Judge Not, Pop's first solo record. And he had had two enormous international successes with My Boy Lollipop, the ska song by Little Millie Small, and then in 1969 in America and England with The Israelites by Desmond Dekker. And so they realized this guy can break the international market. He knows the way to do it. So let's do something with him that nobody else has ever done in Jamaica before. Let's make an album of all original new music that nobody's heard before. Up to that point, albums were basically just collections of singles. So they cut an album, and Leslie Kong says, well, I'm going to call this The Best of the Wailers. And the Wailers flip out, and then especially Bunny, wait a minute, we're young people, you don't know what the best of the Wailers are. We don't know what the best of the Wailers are. We got long careers in front of us. So Bunny says, if you think this is the best of the Wailers to you, it must mean you're not going to be around much longer, so don't do it. So Kong put out the record, called it The Best of the Wailers, and a few weeks later dropped dead at 38. So from that point forward, the words of Bunny Wailer carried a little more weight than they had enjoyed prior to this.